Okay, so we have like I said, on Tuesday, there's lots of stuff going on in this parsha, and specifically the opening statement, the opening idea of the red heifer is a very important theme, also from the Kabbalistic perspective, but it's alluded to in the fact that the Torah itself refers to it as Zot Chukat Torah. This is the decree of the Torah. As I mentioned on Tuesday, it doesn't say this is the decree of the heifer, or it says this is the decree of the Torah. So there's something, it's signaling to us that something about this captures the theme of the whole Torah. And we discussed a little bit about this on Tuesday, and I think we can revisit some of those ideas, but there's also other ideas that we could think about when we talk about the parsha, the red heifer specifically. And like I said, there's a lot to say, and there's important points. And Ben sent a few questions in advance, so I don't know if we'll see how much of it we can address, but we'll see. But either way, if any, we'll take the dive, and I'll maybe give a few minutes of introduction just to introduce one of the points, and then we'll open it up if anybody wants to take the discussion in one direction or another. So the roadmap. First of all, we're basically going to think about, at least in this discourse, at least in the two first chapters that I put up here, prepared to talk about and translated into English with the help of AI. We'll see how much of it we can read inside. Essentially, there's three themes, and each is fascinating. The first is the idea of the word chok, the word decree, which I have to check the English etymology, but I think there is but in Hebrew, the word chok, decree, is related to the word of um, lachkok, to engrave. So in other words, when you set a law, you are actually engraving it in stone, so to speak. So in a way, you could translate that this is the decree of the Torah, but this is the engraving of the Torah. So I'm sure there's some equivalent in English as well, but we'll have to get to that. So the idea of what does it mean that the concept of engraving specifically, in contrast to to the other metaphors we use for the Torah, which is the written Torah and the oral Torah. So in other words, Torah of speech, Torah of writing, and Torah of engraving. And that's one thing we could think about in the context of the red heifer, what makes it so important. The next thing we could talk about is the concept of run and return, which again, we keep coming back to. And again, from the Kabbalistic perspective, is the entire Torah. That's the point of the entire Torah, and the point of the entire Torah is visible and even in the most tangible way could be found in the law of the red cow. And the third thing is the idea of the transformation that we spoke about on Tuesday, and that is that when you burn the cow, you get the ashes, and the ashes, which were the red cow, which is the sign of negativity at the outset, becomes not only neutral but the purifying agent. So these are really the three themes that we can talk about, and we can do one at a time, or we could just go to the second or the third or the first, either way you want. But in the beginning, just to start, if anybody has any comments to talk about um, where we should turn the lens, please share. Otherwise, maybe we'll go through some of these points briefly, orally, and then maybe we'll read it inside a little bit as well, because we want
It
to
is
get the.
interesting how in English common law that there's statutes and there is the common law which is not written but it comes is passed down through interpretation and
Right.
generally statutes override what's written overrides what has been um, almost like a Talmudic kind of thing.
Right.
Um, you know, but it I don't know to what extent. I have never really thought about it until you just sort of mentioned it, and I don't know to what extent that it even applies. But it did occur to me when you said that just now.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. Um, I'm wondering if statue and statute are related.
Yeah,
If they
I
are, if
yeah,
they are, that would be similar to decree and engraving, because
exactly.
ultimately a statue is by engraving the stone. So I wonder if those are related. Thankfully, we live in a time that it shouldn't be that hard to check it up.
Right.
So I guess we have homework.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll
beautiful.
follow up on that. That's good.
Okay, so what do we when we say that the law of the red heifer and the point of the red heifer is those chukat, this is the decree, but this is the engraving. So what is the spiritual aspect of engraving something in a stone as opposed to writing or or speaking? So there's different ways to look at it, and I'm just going to say the two primary ways. And the second is more Kabbalistic, a little bit more abstract. So I don't think we spoke about it in the past, but occasionally we have to bring in some new things as well. So the metaphor of writing, especially when you talk about writing a Torah scroll. So before you had the modern paper that we use, when you write on a scroll, it's very clear that the parchment and the ink remain two separate entities. And that's why it's not uncommon for the ink to break off. And that's why if you have a mezuzah, the law is you're supposed to check the mezuzah every now and then, twice in 7 years or whatever. Because the problem is that just because it was written, okay, now today you write something on a piece of paper, if it doesn't get wet, you can assume it's going to last 500 years, right? But if you're writing on parchment, the especially with the weather changes, the ink could smudge, the ink could break because it remains a separate entity. And in some ways, the idea is what happens to the person when the person studies Torah or learns or tries to internalize the will of God or tries to internalize morality. So one way to think about it, one visual is you're writing the words, the ideas upon yourself, but it still remains two separate things. There is me, there's what I feel, there's my way of my perspective, and then there's the life I try to live. But it's two separate entities. So in other words, this is the will of God. God wants me not to steal, but I would prefer to steal, right? So I have to write the words of God and superimpose it on the parchment. I am the parchment, and the words of the Torah are the letters. So that's one model. And then you move to the Ten Commandments that were written in stone that Moses brought to us. And there it's a different model because here you cannot separate the letters from the stone. That's what happens when you engrave into stone. So this represents a greater unity between the person and the ideas that the person is studying, the word of God that the person is studying, because now we move from the concept of a letter of a letter written on parchment, which remains two separate entities, to something that it actually becomes one with me. And at this point, it's impossible to separate the values that I have and the ideas that I have and the ideas that I've been studying and internalizing from myself because it becomes a unity. It becomes a unity that can no longer be changed. You know, once you learn something, you cannot unlearn it. Right? Once you adapt a certain perspective, it's very hard to go back and see the old model, right? Because now the knowledge, the information, the perspective, right? Someone taught me an idea when I was whatever, younger. And now this is my perspective. This is the way I see the world. You can't separate between me and the idea that I'm thinking about. So when you talk about a relationship with God, that represents a deeper unity with Torah. And that's why the idea of the Ten Commandments written in stone is represents a higher level of internalization than the scroll written with paper with ink on parchment. Both are very good and both are very holy, but the one idea of internalization is a deeper level. So that's the simple level of what engraving means. And then we can go to a more Kabbalistic level, which is a little bit more abstract, but I think we could take the plunge. Okay, so the question becomes like this. When you come to the Kabbalistic level, what does it mean that you have all of the Torah and you have ideas that are engraved? And we're going to add one more metaphor because so far we have two metaphors, engraving on parchment. We have writing something on parchment. We have engraving in a stone. And then we're going to have another metaphor, which is not just engraving in a stone, but engraving in a shining stone. In other words, in a piece of jewelry, and we'll see what that does for us. So the basic idea is to go something like this. When let's say you say there's a mitzvah. A mitzvah is God, divine communication. So you could look at it as letters, as words, God speaking to me. You could also look at it as an idea, it's God's wisdom. So the Torah is classified as God's wisdom. But in both those models, when somebody talks to me and somebody explains some wisdom to me, the question is, how much am I communicating with the wisdom and how much am I communicating with the person themselves? Because your wisdom is not you. Your wisdom is something you talk about and something you think about, but it's not your essence, it's not your core. And ultimately, when you say I'm studying Torah, you could look at it as I'm studying the divine communication with people. So, in other words, God doesn't want this place to be a jungle. So he says, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. This is divine communication with us. But do I feel when I'm studying this Torah that I'm getting the divine essence? I'm getting Hashem himself. And even with an idea that's not just communication to us, but an idea. So is this idea, does this idea define you? If you teach me an idea, do I say I have you? Not necessarily. It's an idea, but the idea is not your essence. So the Kabbalah is saying when we're studying Torah, we're not just trying to get to what is God's word to creation. Torah is that as well. We're not trying to only to get a little deeper than words and say, what is the ideas that God's trying to communicate with us? That's also deeper. That's also important. But nonetheless, when I study ideas, it's the idea. It's not the essence. When we're studying Torah, the point is not the idea. The point is that through the idea, I'm going to connect to God's essence, right? I'm talking to you. Let's say we go out and we're having coffee together. And I say, what are we talking about? We're making small talk. So some person could say, well, we're talking small talk. We're talking about the weather, or we're talking about politics. Or, I don't know, people don't talk politics anymore. We're talking sports. I don't know, right? So everybody, we're making small talk. So you could look at this and say, look at this conversation, feed it to AI and say, what do these people have in common? And the AI is going to say, well, it's a very superficial conversation. They're just talking about ideas that are superficial. But the truth is that that's one angle, but there could be a different angle. Different angle is not about what we're talking about. It's not about what we're drinking or what we're talking about, even the ideas we're sharing. I'm sitting with you and I'm talking to you because I want to connect to you. And the topic of the conversation is just a conduit, it's just a vehicle. And that's the idea we're trying to talk about. When I talk to you and you're telling me whatever you're telling me, I see and I feel and I sense the connection to you. Says the Kabbalah. When I look at paper, when I look at paper or look at parchment, I'm seeing letters. I'm not seeing the essence. When I look at engraved stone, I'm still seeing letters. The letters are the letters of the Torah. The letters are the wisdom of the Torah. I'm seeing letters, but I'm seeing letters engraved in stone. So now it's much closer, right? So the hardware is a metaphor for the essence, and the letter is a metaphor for the communication. So I'm looking at the letter written engraved in stone. I am seeing the letter. I'm getting closer to the essence because now the letter is part of the essence, but I still see the letter. Says the Kabbalah, when you study Torah, it should be, of course, you have ideas. And by the way, same thing as when you're talking to another person, it doesn't really matter. Whatever is true with the relationship with God is true with the relationship with the people. When I'm looking at another person, when I'm learning the words of Torah, I'm learning letters, but the letters have to be like the letters engraved not in a stone, but in a precious stone, in a shining stone, a piece of jewelry. Why? Because over there, because the stone shines or reflects light, the actual letter is even less visible, right? So the point is when we're studying Torah, do I want to know what do I do if my cow gored your cow? Now it's very important. You can look at it as the whole purpose of the Torah is to tell me what to do, how to take care of this specific law with this specific question of torts. But then you could say that's not the point. When I'm learning the Torah and I'm saying two people holding a garment, what should I do? Arguing if it's theirs. I want to know what to do with the garment. Of course, I want to know what to do with the garment, but that's not the experience I feel. I feel that this idea is an expression of the will of God or the presence of God. And if that's the case, the actual idea, not that it disappears. You need the letters because letters are communication. You cannot communicate without letters. But the experience I get is not a black letter. It's not a letter in a stone. It's a letter in a piece of jewelry where I see the light shining through the letters. And the letters are not their own identity, their own independent thing. They sort of fade into the background, and what I see is the precious stone. And the point is, every mitzvah we do, what we're supposed to feel is less of the idea, but the idea is supposed to be there, has to be there, but it's also, this is an idea that's going to connect us with the essence of God. And then we have to figure out how that ties specifically to the red heifer, but that's step number one. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. When you started explaining about the engraving and how it relates to perception, I started thinking about the education, like early childhood education, or even the human perception, because when you mentioned that perceiving God's ideas is similar to communication to other people, it's kind of dangerous because other people can engrave in your ideas that are dangerous. So how that's different, and how we can attune first of all the child and then an adult, how we can distinguish.
Yeah, so that's a good point. But the truth of the matter is that the parents have a tremendous impact on children because the experience you give them are literally engraved in them, and it's very hard to unlearn them for the good and for the bad, right? So the habits that you get when you're young are literally engraved upon you, and your perspectives that you get, it's true for the positive and the negative. And that's why people have to pay a lot of money in therapy because they try to undo the past, and sometimes you could, and sometimes you can't, and sometimes you can't. Then you just have to deal with the results. So I think that we agree that the phenomenon is clear. The phenomenon is that there are experiences that basically you experience, and they don't take a deep engraving in your heart, both for the positive and the negative. The positive ones is there, and some things are more external, and some things are more internalized within you, and it's positive and negative, and that's the responsibility of parents, and that's why that's why it's very important to think about what environment am I giving my children, and that's why I have all the guilt when I do something and I say I don't want this is not the behavior I want to model for my children. The younger they are, the more it's engraved. And that's why it's a tremendous responsibility. And I'm not saying that that I'm living up to that responsibility, but the first step is the awareness. But there's no question. There's no question that adulthood as well, but especially with childhood and education, the habits and the experiences, they could make a very deep impression.
And it's not only education, it's environment, as you mentioned,
Environment. Yeah. When I say
and
education, when I say
ideology.
education, I mean broadly, because education is not just the textbook. Education is how are you teaching your children to react in these circumstances, and how do you teach your child to react to disappointment, or how do you teach your child to be kind? That's education. Education is not just information.
Right. But even for adults, like ideology and
Yeah.
exposure to all kind of different
Yes.
influences becomes engraved.
Yes,
And,
yes,
yeah.
yeah, and that's why it's important to we talked about this in Netanya to regulate the things I think about because it's not like I'm going to think negative thoughts about myself and it's not going to have an impact. And by the way, even writing on parchment has an impact because that's the letters. I think in letters. That letters is what's floating around my conscious mind. We think in letters. We think in words. We think in idea in speech. So whatever I tell myself, the mantras I tell myself, that's going to have an impact. The only difference is how deep would the impact be? So there's different categories. There's written word, which it's relatively easy to erase. There's the engraved word, which is much harder. And then the third dimension that we're introducing is the idea of written the letter into the precious stone, and over there the letter is felt is that's another dimension. That's a little bit different. That's what we're talking about when I'm communicating with you. What do I hear? When you tell me something, what do I hear? You say past, because a lot of, you see, the problem is like this, a lot of deep relationships are very trivial. What do you do with your deep relationships? You're raising children. What are you doing? Most of the day, you're passing the salt and you're taking care of errands and you're picking up the toys, and it's all technical things. And that's why people could get burned out because no one's interested in technical things, right? But what and by the way, people probably, I'm sure some people could get burnt out, quote unquote, of religion or Judaism because what am I doing? I'm eating matzah, I'm doing this and doing that. But the point is, when I'm interacting with the other person, yes, I'm interacting with a surface level concept. I'm doing something for you. I'm going to the store. I'm doing an errand for you. I'm taking out the garbage. But the question is, what do I experience? Do I see you in this experience? Right? When I'm talking to my child about whatever, or my spouse, or doing something technical, are we walking down the street because we have to get to point A or point B? Or are we walking down the street because we really want to connect deeply? And the topic of discussion is less important. Maybe it is important, but that doesn't capture what's happening here. So it's true in human relationships as well. A lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're talking about is surface level. And my own relationships, I have this thing that um, my wife tells me that we're not connecting deeply enough. And what does that mean? We're not talking about deep ideas. And I'm like, okay, that's our conflict because she wants to talk about deep ideas. And I'm like, it's not about the idea. You could talk about trivial ideas. The point is that we're spending time and we're making the connection. And through the idea, through this concept, whatever we're talking about, I sense the other person, right? So then the letter is not so important. It's the fact that this is a letter that is engraved on the precious stone. So I don't know if I'm doing such a great job in conveying the metaphor here. Maybe Rabbi Schneur Zalman will do better. But I think that's I think that's what's at stake here. In other words, are we looking at the idea, the letter, the
Yeah.
experience, or are we looking at what is shining through those letters? And the more you have the light shining through, the less the obvious the letters are, the less distinct, and the less, I don't want to say important because letters are important, but the less that's the whole story. The lens broadens and it's letters that are shining through. There's the light of the precious stone shining through the letter. And therefore, it's not just what to do if two people are holding a garment and each one says it's mine, and the Mishnah says that each one should take an oath and we divide it. I can experience that as a litigant, and I came to court because all I want to do is figure out what to do with this garment, and that's my whole frame of reference, and that's all I'm thinking about. Or I could think about it as someone who is, I want to know what to do about this garment, but I want to know what does God want me to do to this garment when I have a dispute, how to settle this dispute. And when I settle this dispute, I'm not just settling it because we have to find a practical way to settle disputes so we don't end up in anarchy, but I feel that the divine presence is an important part of my life. So now it's not no longer about a garment of what to do about the garment or who should get this dollar, who should get the 50 cents. That's not what it's about. I mean, it is about that because that's the divine will. But the divine will, when I experience the divine will, I experience the divine presence that is shining through the divine will. So two people went to court and we're fighting over a garment and the law is 50-50. Each takes an oath. You get 50%, I get 50%. You walked away, not you. One person walked away with 50% of the garment. I walked away with 50% of the garment and the experience that God is present and here and talking to me and communicating with me. It's a different experience. It's a question of, do I just have the letter or do I have the light shining through the letter?
That's beautiful, Rabbi. But my question was not about. I'm sure you experience God's life, God's light. But if somebody is exposed to the idea that somebody is engraving that conflicts with the divine ideas, is it the God's light stronger, or the person needs to make a conscious effort to connect to to divine ideas?
Yeah, so I'll say something about that's a little bit different than what I said before, because before I said when you're young, it happens naturally. But it does say, Chassidus does talk about this, that when you talk about writing versus engraving, what is harder? Obviously, writing is easier, but writing doesn't go as deep. And in other words, to apply, to say, to get to the point where I want to say that I want something to be engraved in my soul, it takes much more effort. So if I want the positive experiences or the positive meditations to be engraved in my soul, I have to work harder. It's not just think about this once. Let's say I want to change my perspective. If I'm looking at the world in a negative sense or looking at my life in a negative, I want to be more grateful, for example. So I have a certain disposition. I have my animal soul. So I have my disposition, either biologically or evolutionary, that I'm prone to seeing the world in a negative light or seeing myself in a negative light. If I want to change that, it's not enough that I try and meditate once. It has to be ongoing because to engrave is much harder than to just write. Because to engrave, if I want this to have an impact, even physically, it takes more effort and you have to apply more effort and apply more precision. So I think if I understand your question correctly, a person obviously has both positive and negative experiences. If I want to up the positive experience in my life, it's not just to engage. It's not enough to engage in it in a surface level, but I have to work to engrave it. And engrave can mean different things in different contexts. But to apply myself intensely and you're going to need a certain amount of repetition because that we know from the Torah, but we also know that from science that the habits are very powerful. And the more habits and the more you experience the habit, you're actually rewriting the brain, and they don't use the word engraving, but that's really what you're doing. Your engraving means you're making a deep impact in in the way your brain in the circuits of your brain. And the more repetition, the more it takes hold, and the harder it is to unwind it.
Beautiful. So it doesn't happen naturally. It requires human effort.
Yeah, sometimes again, when someone's very young, when someone's very young, person's very impressionable. But as the person gets older, and that's why when it's young, it's easy to learn new things and it's easy to acquire positive habits. When a person's older, it's harder. But harder just doesn't just means that you have to go and engrave. But engrave is possible, always possible.
And also discernment to distinguish which
Yeah.
ideas you want to
Yeah,
cultivate.
that's where you start. When we have the Amida, the weekday Amida, there's 12, there's 18 blessings, really 19, but 18 doesn't matter. We started at 19, we started at 18, became 19. So there's three. The first three is where we praise God. The last three is when we think, and the middle 12 is when we ask for all the person's needs, both individual needs and communal needs. But it's interesting that the first blessing we ask for, if I say, what's the most important thing you have to ask God for? I don't know, health, right? Spiritual health, forgiveness, I don't know, something. The first thing we ask for is da'at, is wisdom. And the reason is because if you don't have any discernment, how are you going to know what to ask for? So the most important thing, even before you could think about what do I need, is before God, please give me what I need, is what do you need? What do you really need? That's a very serious question. What do I really need? What do I really want? And someone wrote, on my Twitter feed, somebody writes, all those people who do not pray, how do you know what you need if you don't pray? Right? So the point is, prayer is not just, oh, I need something. God, could you please give me what you need? The first step of prayer is connecting to the discernment and the wisdom. And wisdom is related to discernment, to figure out what is yet to categorize. That's discernment. What do I really need? What do I really want? What's important to me? What are my values? And that's the first step of prayer. So yes, the first step is what to engrave. The question is, how deep should I write it? Should I write it in letters or should I write it on stone? But the question is, what am I writing? That's important too. Yes, agreed. Okay, go ahead, Ben, please.
So we're talking a lot about writing, but I think back to the fact that Socrates never wrote anything, that the relationship with the interlocutors was a personal one and one that specifically avoided writing. And
Yeah,
then, fast forward, umpteen thousand years to Freud and to talk therapy, which is another instance where change occurs and the interlocutors changed and acquired wisdom not through what was being written and not
right.
through trying to follow the writing and not through engraving, but through interaction and through arguably a erotic, maybe even an animalistic relationship that takes you to a higher level of knowledge and all. So I don't know how that all fits in here, but it's certainly that seems like a giant miss that isn't being even kind of looked at right now, is the fact that that we're only talking about engraving and writing, but in at least historically, it seems that the oral traditions that aren't written are more powerful for the individual, in terms of transformation, in than what's being engraved.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, a very broad point. So I have to think about it. I can't address it fully right now, but I would just say one or two points. First of all, I would say that in the Torah, you also have the model of Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the oral Torah. And at least initially, the first 1300 years of Judaism, that was the model. But I would say the model always had to have both. You always had a written core and then conversation about the core. And the problem is when you just have the ideas and you're not grounded in absolute things that are absolute, then you can drift to anything, right? So the relationship between the written and the oral is very important because if you have the oral, the problem is you're fixed and you can't develop and you can't grow and you can't apply. On the other hand, if it's just totally fluid, then there's no anchor, right? So I agree that there's a very, especially in Jewish tradition, going back to Moses, most of the Torah was conveyed orally, okay?
Well,
But
and Kabbalah itself was
Kabbalah itself.
conveyed or orally, that
Yes.
it was handed down from individual to individual. It was, so to speak, talk about secrets the other day. It was, so to
Yeah.
speak, it was a secretive, and it wasn't so much later that it became,
Yeah.
grounded in a written, you
Correct,
know.
but it's still grounded in the Ten Commandments, in the written Torah, right? The Kabbalah, open up the Zohar, the section of the Zohar. There's 70 interpretations of the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, Genesis, right? So ultimately, things have to be grounded. But the broader point is when we bring a metaphor, no metaphor is all inclusive, right? And the question is when you read a metaphor, you say, what specific idea is this metaphor trying to explain? And in that sense, you need a metaphor, you need a visual, and you have to understand that the metaphor is not all encompassing. So you have to look at every metaphor with humility of where and how. Don't get too comfortable with the metaphor because the metaphor is explaining one aspect. And case in point is what we discussed till now. There's two aspects that you can look at with the metaphor of writing and engraving. One is what it does to the person. When I'm trying to apply the divine word, how deep does it affect me? And how much is it just, oh, I read this today, tomorrow I'll read something else, it's just external. So that's one metaphor. But that's written elsewhere. In this Hasidic discourse that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is talking about is it's almost flipping the metaphor. It's not how much it engraves in me, but when I turn to God or turn to the other in a human relationship, but I turn to God and God is speaking to me. What am I seeing? Am I seeing words and ideas that are distinct from God's essence? Or am I seeing God's essence shining through those words? And here, those metaphors are very helpful because there's a spectrum of course, you always need the letter, right? You always with letters are ideas. People communicate these ideas. We're saying words, we're saying letters. That's how people communicate. The question is, what am I seeing? Am I seeing just the communicated word, or am I seeing the person who's standing behind it? If I were creative, I could find some good metaphors, right? When somebody tells me, "Let's go to the restaurant," I'm hungry. Okay, you could you could say they're hungry. That's not what they really want. What they really craving for is connection. So I have a choice to look at the word and say, "Oh, you want this? I'll give you this." So you know what? So you want it? You're hungry? So here, so I'll order takeout, and it'll be delivered tomorrow with Uber Eats in 5 minutes in Uber Eats, and I'll go back to my newspaper. You got the letter right, but you missed the context. You missed that there's a personality shining through these letters. And the point is, same thing is with the Torah. When I say the Torah, when the Torah says do this or don't do that, it's not just a practical way of living. This is a way of experiencing the divine. So I can look at the Torah as here is an instruction book of what to do if I'm in situation A or B, or I could look at this as a relationship manual. And the question is, how much do I see the independent letter, or how much do I see the hardware, so to speak, or the essence shining through the letter? And when I look at the stone and when I look at the letter written on parchment, I see the letter. Letter is absolutely distinct. When I look at the stone, I can't separate between the letter and the stone. When I look at the letter engraved in a shining stone, I could barely see the letter. The letter is there. I keep the Torah. I listen to what you're telling me. I can't ignore what you're telling me because they say, "Oh, you asked for a glass of water." No, you really want spiritual connection, so I don't have to get you water. No, of course you have to get the water, right? But the question is, how much is this actual specific letter? How much does it feel? How much do you, how much does it stand out as an independent thing, and how much does it fade and have the light shine through it? That's the metaphor we're trying to give. But you have to think about any metaphor you give. There's no metaphor can capture the divine presence. So every metaphor is you have to really narrow down what point in this relationship are we trying to convey with this metaphor. But no metaphor is all inclusive. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I actually wanted to comment or attempt to answer Ben's question, but you did it beautifully. So this is just a metaphor, and a good example would be Arizal. I think he didn't write anything, right?
Right.
That
Yeah.
somebody else wrote it for him, but
His
ideas were
students. Yeah.
so engraved of ideas of Kabbalah, so engraved that we are talking about those ideas today,
Yeah.
although he didn't write a single word. So the engraving is just a metaphor for any kind of communication. That's how I understand.
Correct. And by the way, there is always a tension. In every movement, especially the Hasidic movement, when Rabbi Shneur Zalman wrote the Tanya, which is basically putting the Hasidic ideas on paper in words, with a lot of opposition from his colleagues. Their point was, you cannot write this stuff. This is experiential. This is not intellectual. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the critique against Rabbi Shneur Zalman and the Chabad movement, because Chabad is an acronym from wisdom, understanding, knowledge. How could you intellectualize the intimacy between that a person feels with God, or the experience that a person feels of connection to God? And Rabbi Shneur Zalman was not afraid to do so because he feels you have the idea, you can have the words, you can try to explain what you're feeling and how to feel it and how to get there, but you have to be able to see the light shine through the letters. And in a way that's the better model, because if you just say you have to be there to believe it, you have to experience it to understand it, you're not helping people, right? If you're in a very lofty spiritual level, maybe you can feel it, but everybody else cannot. And also you yourself, you cannot feel it at all times. You can only feel it during times of inspiration. But if it's an idea, if you can articulate this intimacy in a way of an idea, then you can internalize it, you can engrave it in your heart, and you also learn how to see the idea, but not get stuck with the idea, right? And that's what we're trying to say here. There's always the letters, but the letters are an expression of something deeper. And you could look at the letter as an independent thing, or you could look at the letter as this is God speaking. This is the divine experience speaking. And the more you feel what's behind the letter, not that the letter disappears. The letter has to exist. If it ceases to exist, then there's a problem. You're not listening. You're not communicating. But what am I feeling and what's the experience? The experience is becoming something that is far more than just the letter. Okay. So we're not going to have time to do the other things and I have to
But
stop doing it.
did it become more important because it got written down? So
Yes.
that's the Socratic. Plato wrote down what Socrates said. The Tanya was written down, by things that were being carried on, and all. And
If
if
it wouldn't, let
it's
me just tell you, Ben, on a very simple level, if it wouldn't be
the
written, it would be
Talmud,
lost. Could we
okay,
agree with that?
what's
Could
that?
we, on a very basic level, could we agree that if it wouldn't be written, it would be lost?
No, I don't think that that's
No?
true
No? Okay.
necessarily, because the Talmud wasn't written, the oral Torah wasn't written down for thousands of years,
But at some point, you have to have conditions. Okay, we're going beyond the scope of we have to have conditions that will allow for oral tradition, and you have to have in a way it has to be a comfortable environment. And when dramatic change happens, things get lost. And the answer is going to be the combination. That's the answer.
okay.
The
I mean, I,
combination.
I understand where you're coming from, but I do think really important and different point that that did it become serious, only become serious once it got written down? I don't think so. I think the
No,
oral
I
Torah
disagree.
was
No,
just
I
written.
agree. I agree. No. It's not that it only became serious. But the point here is you can't you you're talking about the context of ideas, but I'm saying something else. What I'm trying to say is that just like in a human relationship, it's not about what we say, it's about the connection. But it cannot only be about connection. I also have to listen to what you're telling me. I also have to communicate. In other words, we have to communicate in letters and words because that's what people do and that's what people are. And if you're concerned about whatever you just read this morning, and I'm like, I don't care about that topic. I care about you. I don't care about the topic. That's offensive, right? If we're sitting in conversation and you say, Menachem, I read this amazing article in the paper, and I'm like, I don't care. Why is this guy talking to me about this? I want to connect to him. I don't want to connect to the words he's saying. That's nonsense. Of course, the way to connect, in other words, you need the words, you need the ideas, you have to connect on the level of words. But on the other hand, it cannot just be words. It cannot just be, I'm sitting with Ben because I want his input on this topic. For that, I go to AI. I don't go to you. I go to you because I want to connect to your soul. I want to connect to the person. But on the other hand, you cannot forget it. You cannot ignore the letter. So the letter has to be there. The words have to be there. You have to connect. In other words, the connection is multidimensional, and you can't skip one. If you skip one or over the other, you're missing an important component.
But you do, because something gets written, you now can avoid personal relationships. You
Yes.
can
Yeah.
avoid having to meet people or see people or have that back and forth with somebody
Yeah.
because it's written, and that's an important kind of
Yeah.
loss.
Agreed. On the other hand, if I say, let's just spend time together, but I don't want to hear what you're saying because the topic that you're talking about is not interesting to me. I want to connect on a soul level. It doesn't work. We're
Right.
people. Things have to be concrete. People have to communicate about what the tangible things that are on their mind at this moment. And you can't bypass that to say, I don't care what you're telling me. I'm connecting on a soul level. You're telling me about how your day went. I don't care. I want to bypass that. I want to hear, I want to connect to your essence. It doesn't work that way, right? You have to, you're right. So the words, you see, okay, Kabbalah talks a lot about letters. So on letters, on one hand, it reveals, because when you write something, I know what you're talking. It expresses to me your thoughts or feelings. On the other hand, it limits, because how much could you express with the word? Words are limited. I could say I love you, but does that really explain how I feel? And to the contrary, the more I feel, the more intense the emotion is, the less I become, the less I can articulate. I become speechless. So the point is, yeah, we understand the words on one hand are not on one hand, words are limiting, but that has a plus and a minus. Because without that, how am I going to connect to you? Right? So that's the balance. That's the balance here. We need the letters, but we can't let the letters take over.
Right, because it obviates the need for community. Once you put something in writing, you no
Yeah.
longer are required to have a community, which is is a it's not something that should be ignored as something that of a great loss. When the cell phone happened, we lost the ability to have a community of the house of sharing of
Right.
ideas
Yeah. Yeah.
and people. I
Yeah, I'll
mean,
say one more thing, and then I want to read a paragraph or two inside just to ground it in the letters, because we're
okay,
talking about
all right,
letters, and then we'll conclude, because I have to run early today. Uh, um, I forgot what I was going to say. I forgot what I was going to say. The loss of community. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. So maybe we'll come back. Either way, I want to ground it in words because that's what we're talking about. Let's see. Let's see. This is a translation from AI. Let's see how it works. I'm just going to read two paragraphs. Let's see. Let's see what happens. The matter is as follows. The Torah is called written Torah. The Holy One, blessed be He, speaks and Moses writes. And the words of the scribes, meaning the sages, are called the oral Torah. However, the statute of the Torah, which is the opening statement of this week's parsha, Zot Chukat Torah, this is the statute of the Torah, is the language of chakika, which is engraving. As it is written in the Medrash at the beginning of the parsha, a statute I have enacted, Chuka Chakakti. See, in English it doesn't work, but the Medrash is pointing out that this law does not have a logical reason, and the language it uses, I engraved an engraving. That's how it sounds in Hebrew. Meaning, as the Torah exists in its root and source, where it exists in the aspect of Otiot HaChakika, engraved letters, which is a higher level than the aspect of its being clothed in the level called Otiot HaKtav, written letters, which is what makes it called the written Torah. By way of analogy in a physical sense. So here's the analogy. With letters written on parchment, the letters are ink, which is a foreign and separate substance from the parchment. It had no prior connection whatsoever to the parchment. Only afterward, when one writes the letter in ink on the parchment, they become united and are as one. But engraved letters are, here's Aramaic, mine uve, of and from itself, and are a single absolute thing together with the stone in which they were engraved. In other words, ink, I buy parchment, they were not connected, then they connect. But the letters of the stone are from the same essence as the stone. This is the meaning of the statute of the Torah, that through the commandment of the red heifer, which is a chukah, a statute, you will draw down from above the aspect of otiot hachakika of the Torah, so that from there it should descend and drawn down to the aspect of otiot haktav, i.e., in the written Torah, and from the written Torah, this revelation will be drawn down to the oral Torah. Okay, I'm gonna say, um, okay, I'm gonna stop here, but I'm gonna say one more point. What he's trying to really get at here is, with almost all mitzvot of the Torah, it's possible to ignore God. Why? Because every mitzvah of the Torah has some logic, and therefore you could do it by grasping onto the logic. And I say I'm experiencing the letters. Why am I eating matzah? Because it's reminding me of my history, right? So I'm getting the letters that are written, but I'm not getting the letters that are engraved. In other words, you could in any mitzvah you could latch on to the logical aspect, and then you're forgetting about the divine aspect. It's possible. When it comes to the red heifer, which is super rational and self contradictory for whatever reasons we're not going to get into right now, The only reason why you're doing it is it's because it's the will of God. So here you can't say that I like the letters. I like the way the letters look. No, I'm doing it because these are letters. This is a communication from Hashem. So I cannot experience the letters separate from the stone in this mitzvah because there are no letters. There's nothing logical. Letters means conveying a logical idea. There is no logical idea here. So what is it? It's letters that express the divine presence. And therefore, specifically with this mitzvah, it's actually easier to sense the light shining through the letter and the connection between the letter and the stone. And I can't dilute myself that I'm doing it only because of logic. Because logic is very important. Because logic communicates. If I want to understand the divine wisdom, I have to understand the logic. But logic is also dangerous because logic could say, I have a logical makeup, I have a logical framework, I have a beautiful book of letters, but what's behind the letters? Who's communicating the letters? Right? So that's why specifically this mitzvah is the mitzvah that connects you not just to the letters of the Torah, but to the essence of the Torah. And if you do this mitzvah properly, it trickles down to all the other mitzvot. That's the thesis of the first chapter. The other two chapters, the other two topics, we'll have to keep for next year in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi. Beautiful.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.